Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. In this, the second of my 3 conversations with Tony Abbott about the Australian way of life, we discuss the protest movements sweeping the world and impacting upon Australia. We examine the success of Australian history and what it is that makes the Australian way of life so special. Tony Abbott, it's great to be with you again. There's so many important things to discuss today. We're going to be talking about the Australian way of life, what it means, why it's so important. And it seems that it becomes more important as we think about what has just happened over the last couple of days and couple of weeks. I must admit, I never thought here in Australia we would see a statue of you, a statue of John Howard, covered up in plastic and fenced off the way it has been. That's completely un-Australian. What's happening at the moment?
Well, John, I think there is a gathering assault on our culture more generally. Obviously, what happened to George Floyd in the United States was abominable, absolutely abominable. But the idea that our history is the same, the idea that our police culture is the same, is just wrong. Now, I think the protesters are going too far in the United States, but here they're copycats, dealing with different issues in a different country. And I don't like the copycat culture to start with, but I particularly think that it's out of place here. We've never had slavery in this country. Sure, we've had things that we wouldn't be too proud of, like the blackbirding and so on. But Governor Phillip was absolutely crystal clear in his agreement with the British government before the first fleet set sail that there can be no slavery in a free land and therefore no slaves. He was absolutely crystal clear. The Federation Fathers were absolutely crystal clear that there could never be slavery or anything remotely approaching it in this country. So look, I'm against copycats, and I'm certainly against the denigration of our culture.
What do you think has given rise to this? And I think it's a nice description, copycat culture. It seems to have brought a whole series of things together. What's happened, and why has it got so much attention? Because one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the fact that the massive media attention given to these protests in Australia and around the world is so separate from the mainstream culture.
It's interesting, John. If you go back to the 1970s when you and I were at university, the claim then...
I was 80s. I was suffering from the campus revolts of the 70s.
You're pulling youth on me, okay. But look,
I was suffering your consequences.
Go back to the 70s when I was at university, and the plea for a fair go for women, blacks, gays, etc., was based on the absolutely fundamental understanding that everyone had to be treated equally. That it was wrong by the best lights of our culture to treat people differently on the basis of their colour, their gender,
their religion,
their sexuality,
which was
their religion. And what's happened now is that they do want to treat people unequally based on precisely those things. The very concept that Black Lives Matter is essentially exclusionary. Now, of course, Black lives do matter, but all lives matter. And yet to say all lives matter means that you now get sacked as the editor of a newspaper.
Is there something
or scrapped as the presenter of a radio
Does
program.
it say something about Australia and our search for grievance that, as you say, we have to take aspects of the American culture and society and history which are not ours and import this grievance into Australia to search for grievance?
But again, John, a country which has not that many real existential struggles, we'll find other things to argue about, other things to struggle over. Now, by any objective standards, the Western world generally, the world really generally, certainly countries like Australia, by any objective standards, notwithstanding the ups and downs of the moment, we have it pretty damned good. The technology, the wealth, the acceptance that people find, it's really wonderful by any historical standards, by our own standards of the past, by today's standards in other countries. We're doing so well, but it is in human nature to be restless and discontented. It is in human nature to, I suppose, want to create a kind of a them and us situation. And it's almost like what we're seeing now is a cry of rage against everything. Obviously, there are particular instances in Australia's recent history where the best standards were not
of every
upheld.
country's history.
But this idea that there is something fundamentally wrong, something fundamentally illegitimate, something fundamentally racist about Australia in particular, but Western culture in general, it just does not stand up to serious scrutiny. I say to anyone who's unhappy with Australia, what country would you rather live in? Anyone who thinks that we are in some way racist, sexist, whatever, what country is better? And the truth is, it's almost impossible to identify one. And so I say to those people, let's work to make good better. Let's not try to destroy the good in the search for a mythical perfection, particularly when the perfection that they're aspiring to is, I think, fundamentally misconceived. Because we do not want to treat people differently on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, etc.
Should we take some responsibility for what's happened?
Well,
you were always very clear about values and about Western civilization. We have a school curriculum that doesn't talk about those things, that disdains our civilization. We now have a university culture that completely disrespects and more than that, attacks the notions of our culture that have given this notion of freedom and equality. Are we responsible for what has happened to some extent?
The ignorance of our history, the ignorance of our cultural underpinnings, I think we do have to take some responsibility for as a culture, as a society. I don't think that individual leaders of Australia, or indeed the collective leadership class, can really be blamed for individual acts of vandalism. But the fact that so many people have very little understanding of the real facts of Australian history, the fact that so many people have almost zero knowledge of our cultural underpinnings, such as the New Testament, for instance, is collectively a failing of Australia's leadership class.
And you stood up for those values when you've spoken about people knowing the Bible.
Yeah,
you've been attacked for it.
Yeah,
why are so many of, and let's call them the elites, why are so many of the elites either refusing to engage in these discussions or saying they're unimportant or running away? Because when it comes to culture, when it comes to any aspect of life, you don't win many wars that you don't fight.
All politicians are reluctant to engage in fights they might not be able to win.
Now I'm going to pull you up on that. The left don't do that. So there's many aspects to what you've just said. Why is it that, let's say, politicians of the centre-right feel they are going to lose this debate? Because you've just alluded to the fact they think they're going to lose. What's happened?
Well, they think the tide is against them. They think swimming against the tide is impossible. Therefore, we just have to go with the flow. Now, the problem is, and as a former politician who obviously had an eye to tomorrow's headline and next year's election, obviously you do not want to make unnecessary enemies. But on the other hand, there have got to be some things that are worth fighting for. There have got to be some things that are worth losing for.
The centre left, or the progressive causes, or however you might wish to describe them, seem to have a more solid anchor than some of the centre right, and just in the Western world.
Well, go back to the times of Gough Whitlam, and Whitlam made the point that only the impotent are pure, and he was attacking his own side for being more interested in ideological purity than in winning elections. And again, there is nothing wrong with compromise, provided the true, the beautiful, and the good is actually advanced by the compromise. If we can only take one step forward, let's surrender the second for the moment. But let's not take one step backward in the name of compromise and call that a good outcome.
So you've talked about winning the elections. Is it the case that the centre-right have focused too much on winning elections and not winning the battle of ideas? Because if you were to look at the course of Australian history, and you've mentioned Gough Whitlam, let's say back to 72, who has won or who is winning? The battle of ideas is a constant discussion and debate. Who is winning the battle of ideas?
Well, at the moment, you'd have to say that the orthodox Western position on a whole range of things that was taken for granted for decades is under challenge and I would argue in retreat. Take a classic example, climate change. Now, the science is not settled on climate change. It is absolutely not settled. And my view is that the best science is that carbon dioxide is just one of a range of factors influencing climate. That what man does is just one of many things impacting on climate. And in any event, as a matter of prudential judgment, I would say that you do not want to reduce carbon dioxide with such single-minded ferocity that it damages numerous other important objectives, such as greater prosperity, more jobs, the economic development of the country, and so on. So, but we are very reluctant, we of the centre-right, to take this on. I was told time and time again, look, you can't argue the science. Well, the scientists argue the science, and why can't we say?
We've seen this with the coronavirus. There's no such thing as the science.
Yes, why can't we say that sure, we support the science, but the science is far from settled?
You mentioned sensible balance. How do we restore that sensible balance? I mean, I would argue that mainstream Australians maintain a sensible balance, but how has it been that on a range of issues, a noisy, loud, unreasonable, intolerant minority of the community of 1 or 2 or 3% seem to put out of balance all the rest of us?
John, I think one of the problems that we've had in countries like Australia is that the good guys
are no longer in Parliament.
Well, there may be that, but the good guys love to be polite. We have a natural aversion to saying things that we know others will take great offence to, and even if...
And we have a natural aversion to smashing windows and spray painting monuments.
Yeah, absolutely right. But when someone says that they are doing this because of the terrible injustices that have been committed against them or their kind, we have a natural aversion to saying, well, actually, when you examine these injustices, they're not nearly what you claim them to be, or if they were, they're not now, or if they are now even, this is not the way to go about fixing it. So we are a bit conflict averse, and that's not a bad thing, but only up to a point. Some conflicts cannot be avoided. Some fights have to be had.
How is it that the political elites, the administrative elites, the business elites have become so removed from mainstream values?
Well, part of the problem is that all of us have become collectively less versed in our history. All of us have become collectively less convinced in our faith. And so, in one sense, the business leaders are simply a reflection of the cultural weakening of these times. But there are other factors at work as well, and I would argue that compulsory superannuation has been a key element in the weakening of the business community's commitment to economic reform. When you've got union super funds controlling large swathes of a public company's capital and influencing or determining who are the directors of those public companies, influencing or determining who take on many of the management roles, the corporate affairs, the government relations positions in these companies. When you invite people into capitalism who don't really believe in capitalism, is it any wonder that capitalism loses faith in itself?
So what's the future of capital? We'll go to the big topics. What's the future of capitalism when capitalism is perhaps, or capitalists are losing faith in the system?
In the end, capitalism will survive because capitalism works in a way that socialism doesn't. But we may have to go through a bad period before people wake up to the problem.
And one of the things that has been commented upon overseas is that mobs have taken democracy upon themselves, and it's not, and of course it's not democracy. That if a statue, for example, is to be removed, and we'll take that as an example, that is for the democratically elected town council or the national government. But when did we...
Mobs should not be allowed to take the law into their own hands. They absolutely should not.
And when did we allow that to happen?
Well, again, the police should not have stood by while that statue of Colston was toppled in Bristol. The police should not have stood by while hundreds and, in some cases, thousands of protesters breached the social distancing rules. Regardless of what you think of the social distancing rules, they apply to everyone or they apply to no one.
Exactly. And for Australians, this double standard was so frustrating. And then you first had the double standard, and then you had the frustration of no politician calling out the double, Labor or Liberal, it didn't matter. No politician called that out.
Look, this is one of the reasons why we are, I think, drifting to some extent, because the people whose job it is to tell us the truth and give us a lead are not being as clear and as forthright as they should be.
We've spoken a lot, and Australians have spoken a lot about the need for concrete reform proposals to improve the economy, concrete proposals from business. I want to draw this conversation to an end gradually by asking you, what are the concrete proposals for cultural reform so that we understand our freedoms, we understand Australia is the best country in the world? So how do we start putting these aspects on the map? So, of course, the IPA, for example, has done a lot of work on school curriculum, on the role of universities, on understanding of our freedom through our Foundations of Western Civilization program and our work with young people. What are some of the building blocks to that cultural reform agenda? And I even hesitate to call it cultural reform agenda, because culture is not what the state imposes. It is what we build as a community. but it might rely upon aspects of the government, of our cultural institutions, to rebuild that, if it can be rebuilt.
Yeah, well, John, in my view, everyone has got to understand our history more and better, and everyone has got to be familiar with the broad Western canon, particularly what might be thought of as its Australian variant. If you don't understand the things that have shaped the culture in which you live, it's very hard to navigate properly. If you don't know the past, how can you possibly make sense of the present and build a better future? And again, the sheer ignorance. The IPA did some work a couple of years back on millennials and pointed out that less than 50% of millennials, I think it was, had any real idea of what the 26th of January commemorated. Something like 58% of millennials thought that capitalism had failed. Something like 65% of them had a positive view of socialism, and that's because 51% of them had never heard of Mao and 42% of them had never heard of Lenin. So look, you've got to start with the foundation stones, and the foundation stones of cultural literacy, if you are living in a country like ours, are an awareness of the great books, and the Bible is the greatest book of all. I'm not saying you've got to have religious faith, but you've got to have a certain amount of religious knowledge. And then there's the history. One of the best biographies of the last few years was the Andrew Roberts biography of Churchill. And one of the many instructive points that he makes is that Churchill's speeches to the British people during the Second World War were peppered with references to our Long Island story, because everyone knew it. Everyone knew it back then. Almost no one knows it now. One of the guys I served with in the Davidson Fire Brigade is a Pommy migrant who was in the British Army. He would be in his late 30s. And he said, look, the history we were taught in British schools 20 years ago was this litany of racist exploitation. That was the story of Britain that we were getting from our schools. Now,
so you can understand why people in the streets think that. Yeah.
He was sufficiently resistant to all of that to join the British Army and serve for a number of years. And he's a person of, I think, decent, pretty middle of the road values now. But if people are constantly bombarded with this self-hatred in their formative years, and when their parents feel intellectually ill-equipped to counter it, when their peers rarely have the self-confidence to question it, is it any wonder that doubt is everywhere?
And in our next conversation, we're going to talk about how to build that confidence and how we restore the idea of mainstream Australian values to the centre of our public debate. Tony, thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Good to talk.